Title: Lightning. Chapter 1. The Move. The rain had been pouring since the early hours of the morning, dark clouds swallowing the sky, as if nature itself were preparing for something sinister. The first rumble of thunder cracked through the silence, just as Mark pulled into the long driveway of his new home. He barely noticed the weather, the cold, damp air, the sharp sting of raindrops against his skin. He was tired, physically, mentally, emotionally exhausted. The house, standing tall and proud at the end of the driveway, looked far more imposing than he'd expected. He had only seen it in pictures, a spacious modern home nestled in the suburbs, surrounded by old trees and a thick forest on one side. It was supposed to be a fresh start for him and his son Ethan, after a year of tumultuous grief. They needed this. They needed to leave the past behind. But as he pulled the car up to the porch, something about the place unsettled him. It wasn't just the weather or the somber stillness of the surroundings. There was a heaviness in the air, a quiet, oppressive weight that seemed to cling to everything. Mark brushed it aside as best as he could. The move had been stressful, and with everything else on his mind, the house was probably just an unfamiliar setting that would feel different once they settled in. He stepped out of the car, locking it quickly as the rain began to pour harder. Ethan, sitting in the back seat, remained silent. He hadn't said much since they left their old home. His son had always been quiet, introspective, especially after everything that had happened. Mark tried to tell himself that this would be a good change for him, a chance to heal. But deep down, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the house wasn't quite as welcoming as it seemed. "Come on, Ethan," he called softly, his voice barely audible over the storm. Ethan's eyes flickered up from the window as he unbuckled his seatbelt. There was something distant in his gaze, as if the boy was looking through him, not at him. Mark tried not to dwell on it. This wasn't the time for doubts. The door creaked open, revealing the dim hallway of the house, where the shadows clung to the corners like living things. As Mark carried the last of their belongings inside, he felt the floorboards beneath him groan and shift, as if the house were settling in on itself, holding its breath. It was an old place, much older than it had appeared in the pictures. A new coat of paint couldn't cover the age of the wood or the subtle creaks of the foundation. He felt that strange weight again, pressing down on him. He glanced over at Ethan, who had already wandered into the living room, his gaze lost in the grand space. It had a large bay window that overlooked the forest in the back, the one that seemed to stretch on forever into the unknown. The shadows outside seemed to deepen as dusk fell, the forest swallowing the fading light. The boy seemed entranced, standing perfectly still, eyes wide, staring into the dark expanse. Mark's throat tightened. "Ethan." His voice cracked slightly. Ethan didn't respond. Mark took a cautious step toward him, but before he could reach out, a sudden burst of thunder shook the house, rattling the windows and making Mark jump. Ethan didn't flinch. "Ethan, are you okay?" he asked, this time with more force, stepping closer. The boy turned his head slowly, his wide, glassy eyes fixing on his father's. There was something about the way he looked at Mark, blank, vacant. A strange kind of fear crept up Mark's spine. It wasn't just the shock of the move, the strain of the year. It was something else, a sense that his son was no longer entirely present in this world. "Did you hear that?" Ethan asked softly, his voice distant, almost robotic. "Hear what?" Mark asked, his heart racing now. "The lightning." Ethan's voice trembled, but not in fear, in something else. "It's here. It's outside." Mark paused, perplexed. "What do you mean it's outside?" Ethan didn't answer, only turned back to the window. Mark stared after him, confused, before shaking his head. It was just the storm. His son's imagination had always been a bit wild. Perhaps the stress of the move was just getting to him. But even as Mark began to unpack the last of their belongings, his mind wandered back to Ethan's strange behavior, the way the boy hadn't flinched when the thunder shook the house, the strange far-off look in his eyes. It all felt off. Something wasn't right. Later that evening, as they settled into their new home, Mark and Ethan sat together on the couch, the rain still pounding on the roof. The wind howled outside, whipping around the corners of the house. They had set up the living room, but the space still felt sterile, empty. It lacked warmth, lacked a sense of home. Mark glanced over at his son, who was staring at the window once more, the same distant look in his eyes. "Are you okay, Ethan?" Mark asked, his voice softer now. The boy turned to him, his face expressionless. "I saw the lightning again, in the window." Mark's brow furrowed. "There's no storm anymore, Ethan." "I know, but it's there," Ethan murmured, his voice barely audible. "It was right outside. It's in the window. It keeps coming." Mark looked at him, concern creeping into his chest. "It's just a storm, son. You're tired. You need to sleep." But Ethan wasn't listening. He was staring at the window, his face frozen in that unnerving trance-like state. Mark stood up, walking over to the window to check for himself. But the night outside was still and calm. No lightning, no storm, just the dark expanse of the forest. He turned back to Ethan, who still hadn't moved. Mark reached down to touch his shoulder. "Ethan, please, let's go to bed." But Ethan suddenly jerked away, his face twisted in terror. "It's not just lightning, Dad. It's something else. Something's watching me." Mark froze, his heart pounding. "What do you mean?" "It's like lightning," Ethan whispered. "But it's not just light. It's something that comes through the window and gets inside." His voice trembled now, barely a whisper. "I don't know what it wants, but it's been following me. Every night." Mark stood back, his mind racing. He had to calm the boy. It was just a nightmare. A new home. A new place. It must be the stress of moving. Ethan had been through so much already. But despite Mark's reassurances, something inside him couldn't let go of the feeling that Ethan was telling the truth. The storm outside, the flashes of light in his son's eyes. There was something about it. Something wrong. Scene 2. The unsettling pattern. Over the next few nights, things only got stranger. Every night, Ethan's behavior became more erratic, his eyes darker, more tired. He stopped talking about the lightning, but his fear remained. He began to speak in his sleep, repeating words Mark couldn't understand. The more time passed, the more Mark felt like he was losing touch with reality. One evening, as the storm began again, Mark was lying in bed, unable to sleep, the weight of the house pressing down on him. The storm outside raged as thunder cracked violently in the distance. He tried to shut his eyes, but the sound was deafening. Then, through the din of the storm, he heard it, the unmistakable crack of lightning. But when he opened his eyes and looked toward the window, there was no storm, only darkness. Then he heard it, a faint whisper coming from the other side of the room. He shot upright, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was still, silent. Ethan was standing by the window again, his face expressionless, his eyes fixed on the darkness outside. "Ethan," Mark whispered, fear crawling up his spine. The boy didn't respond. Mark stood up, his legs unsteady. He walked over to the window slowly, his breath shallow, but when he peered out, there was nothing there. Just the dense forest outside, the shadows swallowing the night. He turned back to his son, ready to pull him away, but Ethan wasn't looking at him anymore. He was staring at the window, eyes wide, his expression blank. And then it came again, the flash of lightning, just a flicker, but it was unmistakable. The room lit up for a second, followed by a deep rumble of thunder. But when Mark looked back at the window, nothing had changed. There was nothing there. But Ethan wasn't moving anymore. And that's when Mark knew that something in this house, something in this new life they were trying to build, wasn't just strange. It was alive. Chapter. Summary. In Chapter 1, the unsettling atmosphere of Mark and Ethan's new home is set. Mark struggles to adjust to their fresh start, while Ethan begins to speak of something terrifying. Lightning that appears at the window, something strange that watches him from the dark. Despite Mark's reassurances, the sense that something is horribly wrong in the house grows, building tension as both father and son begin to realize that there are far darker forces at work than they ever expected. The first real hints of the supernatural enter the story, leaving readers with a chilling sense of dread and anticipation for what's to come. Chapter 2. The first glimpse. The house, once full of promise and the smell of fresh paint, now felt cold and hollow. The strange heaviness that had followed Mark since their arrival had only worsened with time. It wasn't just the house's age or the isolation of their new life. No, it was something far darker, something that lurked just beneath the surface. Ethan's behavior, his insistence on seeing lightning when there were no storms, had turned from a curiosity into a quiet, creeping terror. Mark could no longer ignore the sensation that someone was watching them. The first few days after moving in had passed in a blur of unpacking and settling into a routine. Mark tried to push aside the unease that gnawed at him, attributing it to the stress of the move, the strain of trying to rebuild a broken life. Ethan, too, seemed to be trying his best to adjust, but his behavior became more erratic with each passing day. Mark had noticed that his son seemed more withdrawn, more detached than usual. When they first moved, Ethan had been excited about the new house, eager to explore, asking questions about every little thing. But now, he barely spoke unless spoken to, his eyes often fixed on nothing, staring at the empty walls or the dark corners of their home. It was late in the evening when it first happened. Again. Mark had just finished dinner and was cleaning up the kitchen when he heard it. The soft, high-pitched hum of his son's voice. At first he thought it was just his imagination, the lingering remnants of stress. But then the words grew clearer. No more lightning tonight. No more flashes. Mark turned around sharply, his heart skipping a beat. Ethan was standing at the window in the living room, his back to the room, staring outside into the pitch-black night. The storm had long since passed, leaving the air still and thick with moisture, but there was no lightning, no flash of light to explain his son's words. "Ethan?" Mark asked cautiously, his voice low, trying not to startle him. Ethan didn't respond. His gaze remained locked outside, as though his eyes could pierce through the darkness. Mark felt a cold shiver run down his spine as he stepped closer. The room was eerily quiet, except for the soft hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen. "Ethan," Mark tried again, gently this time. "What do you mean by no more lightning? There's no storm tonight." Ethan turned slowly, his face pale, his eyes wide and glassy. "The lightning," he whispered. "It's gone, but it's still here." Mark's blood ran cold. "What do you mean, it's still here?" But Ethan didn't answer. He only stared back at his father with a hollow expression that sent a sickening chill through Mark. It was as though his son had vanished into the distance, leaving only an empty shell behind. Suddenly, Ethan jerked his head to the side, his eyes darting to the corner of the room where the shadows seemed to pulse unnaturally. Mark followed his gaze, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the creeping darkness, clinging to the corners of the room like an insidious presence. Mark swallowed hard, his mouth dry. He took a step back, eyes never leaving his son. "Ethan, you're scaring me. Why don't you go to bed, okay? We'll talk more in the morning." Ethan's head snapped back around to meet Mark's eyes. "It's not a dream," he said softly, his voice almost lost in the heavy silence. "It's real. It comes through the window, and it looks at me. It's waiting." Mark felt the air around him thicken as he processed his son's words. He tried to remain calm, but something in his gut told him this wasn't just a passing phase. Ethan's words weren't the ramblings of a child with an overactive imagination. There was an edge to them, a darkness that Mark couldn't quite explain. He quickly walked over and placed his hand gently on Ethan's shoulder. "Listen, I know you've had a rough time adjusting, but this—" He hesitated, trying to find the right words. "This isn't something we can worry about. You're just tired, that's all." Ethan didn't respond. He simply looked down at his feet, his expression unreadable. Mark took a deep breath, his heart still pounding in his chest. He turned to leave the room, but before he could step away, Ethan whispered once more, "It's not the lightning, Dad. It's the thing behind the window." Scene 2. Unease growing. That night, Mark lay awake, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The air felt thick, oppressive, and every tiny sound in the house seemed amplified. The house felt alive in ways that made his skin crawl, and the dark corners of the room seemed to watch him. It was the same feeling he had when he first walked through the door. a sense that something was wrong. Mark rolled over, glancing at Ethan, who was curled up in his bed, the covers pulled tightly around him. The boy had been silent for hours now, and Mark had hoped that his odd words earlier had been just a child's fantasy, something that would fade with time. But deep down, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He turned on his side, glancing at the clock. 3:14 a.m. The storm had passed, but the rain was still falling steadily against the windows, the occasional rumble of thunder echoing in the distance. Mark closed his eyes, attempting to calm his mind, but the unsettling feeling persisted. He heard it again, the soft scrape of something against the floor. Mark's eyes shot open, heart leaping into his throat. His first instinct was to check on Ethan, but something kept him from moving. The scraping sound came again, louder this time, followed by a soft tap, tap, tap against the window. Mark's breath hitched. He lay perfectly still, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. It wasn't the wind. This was something deliberate, something outside. He could feel it, the presence, like a weight pressing against the window. He stared into the blackness, his pulse quickening. Slowly, carefully, Mark climbed out of bed and moved toward the window. The room was cold, the air thick with dread. He approached cautiously, his footsteps barely audible. As he reached the window, his heart stopped. There, pressed against the glass, was a silhouette, a figure. It was only for a moment, but the shape was unmistakable. A tall, thin shadow, its outline distorted by the rain on the glass. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, vanishing into the darkness. Mark stumbled backward, his mind racing. Had he imagined it? Had the storm played tricks on him? But when he turned to look at Ethan, who remained still in his bed, the boy's eyes were wide open, staring at him. "They're here," Ethan whispered, his voice faint but clear. Mark froze in place. His chest tightened as he looked at his son. The boy's face was pale, his eyes wide, locked onto the window where the figure had been. There was no comfort in his gaze, no reassurance, only fear. "They're always here," Ethan said softly, his voice trembling. "They watch from the window. They watch me." Scene 3. The history. The next morning, Mark was unable to shake the terror of the previous night. He tried to rationalize it, to convince himself that the wind, the rain, and his tired mind had created some kind of illusion. But he couldn't erase the image of the shadow at the window, nor the unsettling feeling that had clung to him ever since. He spent the morning researching the house, hoping to find an explanation. There had to be something. Some reason why both he and Ethan felt so uneasy. It didn't take long to uncover a dark history. The house, he learned, had once belonged to a family that had vanished without a trace nearly 20 years ago. There were whispers in the town about strange happenings in the house before they disappeared. Rumors of odd lights at night, strange noises, and the unsettling feeling of being watched. The family's disappearance had never been explained, and the house had been left abandoned for years, until it was finally sold to Mark. The more he read, the more he realized that the house had a history of attracting attention, unsavory attention. And the shadows that seemed to linger in every corner, the strange coldness in the air, the way Ethan had become fixated on the window. It all began to make an uncomfortable kind of sense. Mark put the papers down, feeling the weight of the discovery settle in his chest. He glanced at Ethan, who was sitting silently at the table, his eyes wide and unblinking. "Ethan, did you know about the family that lived here before us?" Mark asked quietly. Ethan's gaze flickered, but he didn't speak. They were watching," Ethan finally whispered, his voice barely audible. "They never left. They're still here." The chapter summary. In Chapter 2, the unsettling events escalate as Mark tries to make sense of his son's increasingly strange behavior and the inexplicable occurrences in their new home. Ethan's fixation on the lightning and the presence at the window takes a more sinister turn, and Mark begins to uncover the dark history of the house. The chapter builds suspense and tension, setting the stage for a deeper descent into horror, as the line between the supernatural and the terrifying reality of their situation becomes harder to distinguish. Chapter 3. The Closet. The nights had become unbearable. Mark could no longer dismiss Ethan's growing paranoia as mere childhood imagination. The whispers of lightning from the boy, his muttering about something lurking in the darkness, had moved from fleeting fragments of a troubled mind to undeniable symptoms of a deeper, darker presence. Something had entered their lives, something that couldn't be explained away by logic, something that was as old and relentless as the storm clouds that haunted their nights. Mark hadn't been able to sleep for days. Every time his eyes began to close, the faintest scraping sound would reach his ears, like nails dragging across wood. He'd look around the room, but each time, everything remained still, too still. It wasn't just the house, it was the very air that hung thick with something unspeakable. Ethan had been especially quiet that day, withdrawn in a way that Mark hadn't seen before. The boy spent hours sitting in front of the window, eyes fixed on the forest outside, murmuring things under his breath that Mark couldn't hear. Every now and then, his head would twitch, as if responding to something only he could see. At dinner, Ethan barely touched his food, his mind lost somewhere far beyond the table. "Ethan," Mark finally said, his voice gentle but firm, "we need to talk about this. The lightning, the figures in your room. You've got to tell me what's going on. What do you see?" Ethan didn't answer. He simply stared at his plate, his fingers tracing the edge of his glass, eyes clouded with an unreadable emotion. The silence between them grew heavy until Mark couldn't bear it any longer. "Please talk to me," he urged. "I can't," Ethan whispered, barely audible. "It's in the closet." Mark froze. The air around them seemed to thicken as the words settled between them. His mind raced. He had heard Ethan speak of the closet before, but this time it was different. There was no hesitation in his voice. It was a simple, chilling statement. "It's in the closet." Mark's heart skipped a beat. "What's in the closet, Ethan?" Ethan looked up, his eyes wide and filled with fear. "It's not like before, not like the lightning," he said, his voice trembling. "It watches me from there." Mark stood up quickly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "We're going to find out what's going on," he said, more to himself than to Ethan, his voice tight with tension. "Come on, we're going to check it out." Ethan didn't move. His face remained pale, his lips trembling as he stared at the kitchen door that led to the hallway. "Don't. Please don't," he whispered, his voice cracking. "It knows. It knows we're watching." Mark swallowed hard and walked toward the hallway, his steps hesitant. The moment he reached the door to Ethan's room, a chill ran down his spine. The house was silent, too silent. Even the usual creaks and groans of the old house had ceased. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath. He opened the door to Ethan's room, and immediately, the stale, oppressive air hit him. The room was bathed in the soft glow of the moonlight filtering through the blinds, but the shadows seemed unusually deep, as if they were moving on their own. Mark turned toward the closet. It was closed, the door slightly ajar, just enough to suggest that something was hiding inside. His heart began to pound louder in his chest. As Mark approached the closet, Ethan's voice broke the silence. "Don't open it," he whispered urgently. "Please don't." Mark paused. There it was again, the same feeling of foreboding that had plagued him since they'd moved in. His breath hitched in his throat. He tried to push past the fear, to be strong for his son, but the unease was suffocating. He glanced at Ethan, who was sitting on the bed, his eyes fixed on the closet with an expression of pure terror. It was almost as if the boy knew something he didn't. "Ethan," Mark said gently, "I'm just going to check it out. Nothing's going to happen." But even as he spoke the words, Mark wasn't sure he believed them. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, a primal warning deep inside him urging him to turn away. Something is wrong. With a deep breath, Mark pushed the closet door open. Scene 2. The cold presence. The closet was empty. The clothes hung limply on the rack, the shelves stacked with old boxes and forgotten trinkets. But there was nothing that could explain Ethan's terror. Mark exhaled sharply, relief washing over him. "See, Ethan, there's nothing here." But as he stepped back from the closet, he felt it, presence. It was subtle at first, like a shadow brushing against his skin. He turned quickly, his heart racing. But there was nothing there. No figure, no movement, only the suffocating silence. Then, as Mark reached to close the closet door, he felt it again. This time, it was more intense, like a chill running up his spine. The air around him grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly. His breath became visible in front of him, misting in the dim light. He froze. The closet door creaked slightly, as though it was being pushed from the inside. Mark took a slow, cautious step back. His hand instinctively reached for Ethan, who was still sitting on the bed, his eyes wide with fear. He hadn't moved. Suddenly the door slammed shut with a deafening crack. Mark gasped, stumbling backward, his mind racing. The temperature in the room dropped even further, the air turning icy. He felt a heaviness in the air, as though the walls themselves were pressing in on him. The house groaned in protest, but this time it didn't sound like the usual creaks. It sounded like something alive. A soft rustling came from inside the closet. Mark's heart stopped. He turned toward the bed, but Ethan was no longer sitting there. The bed was empty. "Ethan?" Mark's voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. The rustling came again, this time louder. Mark turned back to the closet. The door was still closed, but now the faintest slivers of light seeped through the cracks, casting eerie shadows onto the floor. Then, a voice, a whisper so soft Mark wasn't sure if he had imagined it, came from within the closet. It was low and cold, like the wind howling through a graveyard. "Come closer." Mark's blood ran cold. His pulse hammered in his ears. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The voice was unmistakably not human. "Ethan!" Mark shouted, turning frantically to look for his son, but there was no sign of him. A low growl emanated from the closet, and Mark's heart nearly stopped in his chest. His body was frozen in place as he stared at the closet door, now trembling with an unseen force. He could hear the sound of something scratching at the inside, clawing against the walls, desperate to get out. The door rattled violently. Mark's mind raced. This couldn't be real. This had to be a dream. But no matter how hard he tried to dismiss it, the reality of the situation was undeniable. Something was in there, and it wasn't just the wind. The scratching turned into a pounding, rhythmic and furious, as though whatever was inside was desperate to get out, desperate to escape. The house moaned in pain, its timbers creaking as if the very foundation was about to give way. Mark stumbled backward, his heart hammering in his chest. No, no, no. This wasn't happening. This was just his imagination. He was tired. It was the stress. But the fear in his gut wouldn't let him ignore it. With shaking hands, Mark reached for the closet door, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His fingers touched the cold, splintered wood, and before he could stop himself, he pulled the door open. Scene 3. The presence revealed. The closet was empty. At least, it looked empty. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he stepped back, eyes scanning the darkness inside. The shelves were still filled with boxes, the clothes still hanging lifelessly. But it wasn't just the empty space that terrified him. It was the faint, creeping mist that seemed to swirl just beneath the clothes, just at the edges of his vision. The air was thicker now, as though something unseen was pressing in on him from all sides. Then from the corner of his eye, Mark saw it, a flicker of movement, too quick to catch clearly but unmistakable. He whirled toward the sound, his heart in his throat. A dark figure was standing at the back of the closet, its form indistinct, melting into the shadows. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, shone with a faint, unnatural glow, but the rest of its face remained obscured in the darkness. The figure seemed to... Chapter 4. The article. The atmosphere in the house had changed since that night. What had started as unease, as a creeping feeling that something was off, was now an undeniable truth. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he was no longer alone in the house. Ethan had been quiet, too quiet, and his once vibrant eyes were now hollow, distant. Even his presence seemed to fade in and out of the room, as though he were no longer fully part of this world. Mark, on the other hand, had tried to push the fear aside, bury it deep within himself, hoping to protect his son from it. But the house was too quiet, too full of whispers. Each creak of the floorboards sent a shiver down his spine. The walls, which had once seemed to embrace the family with their warmth, now felt suffocating, pressing in around them. The unease wasn't just in the house, it was inside him. He tried to focus on work, to lose himself in anything that could break the constant pull of dread that had settled on his chest. But even at the office, even when surrounded by the hum of the fluorescent lights and the constant buzz of the world outside, he couldn't escape it. That day, however, something changed. It was a Saturday afternoon. The weather had cleared after another evening of storms, leaving behind a thick fog that clung to the trees in the backyard. Mark sat in the living room, a stack of bills and unopened letters on the coffee table in front of him, trying to distract himself from the growing sense of doom that hovered like a storm cloud just above his head. The phone rang, a shrill, sudden noise that made him jump. He glanced at the caller ID. It was his old friend, Steve, calling from the city. "Hey, Mark." Steve's voice crackled through the receiver, sounding distant and uncertain. "I know this might be a bit out of nowhere, but I came across something you might want to see. I was looking through some old local news archives and found an article about your place." Mark felt his blood run cold. "What article?" "It's about the house, man," Steve said, hesitating for a moment before continuing. "It's about the family that lived there before you. You're going to want to read this." Mark's hand tightened around the phone. "What's it about?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You should probably just read it for yourself," Steve replied, his voice lowering. "I'll email you the link." Scene 2. The history of the house. An hour later, Mark sat at his desk in front of the computer, Steve's email sitting ominously in his inbox. He stared at it for a moment, unsure whether he was ready to dive deeper into the mystery. Part of him knew that this article might reveal things that would tear down the fragile wall of denial he had built around himself. But another part, a darker part, was already bracing for the worst, already dreading what he might learn. He clicked open the email. The subject line read, "Strange Disappearances in Cedarwood Hollow." Beneath the title was a small summary. Unsolved mysteries and disturbing reports surround the abandoned house on 16th Avenue. The article itself was a mix of local folklore and strange, unexplainable events. Mark scrolled through it quickly, his eyes darting over the paragraphs, absorbing only the words that leapt out at him. The first part of the article detailed a string of disappearances from years ago. Disappearances that seemed to center around a single property, the one that Mark now owned. It started with a young family, the Walkers, who had moved into the house in the early 90s. For the first few months, everything seemed normal. But after a particularly violent storm, the family began acting strangely, isolating themselves from neighbors, shutting all the windows at night, and refusing to leave the house. The neighbors had reported strange lights in the windows, the occasional flicker of movement, but no one had ever seen the Walkers in public again. Then one night they simply vanished. No note, no sign of struggle, just gone. The article described a series of rumors that had circulated after the disappearance. People spoke of seeing shadows in the windows, of hearing whispers at night, of feeling watched, always watched, when they came near the house. But it wasn't just the Walkers. Several other families had lived in the house over the years, each leaving abruptly, leaving nothing behind but the faintest trace of their existence. One particular account stood out. A woman named Clara Montgomery, who had lived in the house in the late 80s, claimed that she had seen strange lights in the woods behind the house. She also mentioned hearing voices on the wind, whispers that seemed to come from the trees themselves. But the most disturbing part of her account was when she described seeing figures, humanoid shapes, staring at her from the windows. "I never felt alone," she had said in an interview. "I thought it was just me being paranoid. But when I left, I realized I wasn't the only one who felt it." The article went on to describe the unsettling reports from the local sheriff's department. The last investigation into the house had been years ago, but there had been no conclusive answers, no bodies recovered. The only thing that had been found were photographs, disturbing photographs, of the families who had lived there. In each photo, there was a strange distortion in the background, something watching them. Mark's stomach turned. He clicked open a link to the old photo archives. His fingers hovered over the mouse as he prepared himself to see what he had hoped to avoid. The photo opened, its details slow to load. At first, it seemed like an ordinary family portrait. 2 parents and their child standing in front of the house. But there was something off about it. The shadows in the background were too thick, too unnatural, as though they were shifting, moving around the figures in the photo. There were no trees in sight, no features of the house, just an endless dark void surrounding them. Mark felt his throat go dry. His heart raced as he zoomed in on the corner of the picture, where the shadowed outline of a figure, tall, thin, with glowing eyes, stood in the background. It wasn't a person. It couldn't be. The outline was too distorted, too inhuman. Mark slammed the laptop shut. His breath came in shallow gasps. What was happening? What was this place? Isambatskata Scene 3, the photograph in the attic. Shaken by what he'd read, Mark decided to visit the attic. He'd noticed a small, dusty chest hidden behind the rafters when they moved in, and something about it had always unsettled him. Now, with the weight of the article still fresh in his mind, he felt an unshakable compulsion to see what was inside. He made his way up to the attic, his feet heavy as he climbed the creaking stairs. The door to the attic was slightly ajar, as it always had been. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the beams of sunlight that filtered through the small window casting long, eerie shadows across the room. The chest sat in the far corner, half hidden beneath old, faded blankets and boxes full of forgotten memories. Mark took a deep breath and approached the chest. The metal handle was cold to the touch, and it creaked loudly as he lifted the lid. Inside, there were old family albums, yellowed with age. There were also some loose photographs, all of them black and white, showing families smiling and posing in front of the house. At first glance, they seemed perfectly normal, but as Mark shuffled through the photos, he began to notice the same thing that had been in the article, the shadows in the background. They weren't just shadows. They were figures, their forms blurred and indistinct, their faces hidden in the darkness. Some of them were far off in the distance, but others were closer, looming over the families in the photos. The longer he stared at them, the more their presence seemed to grow. One photograph stood out. It was a close-up of a family, 2 parents and a young girl standing in the yard. The mother's face was distorted, her eyes wide and filled with horror, her hands raised in front of her as if to shield herself from something unseen. Behind them, in the background, the shadows had taken on a more distinct form. The figure was towering, a shadowy figure with long arms and a wide grin, its eyes glowing with an eerie, otherworldly light. Mark staggered back, his mind reeling. He dropped the photo, letting it flutter to the ground. There was something alive in the pictures, something that moved with the people, something that had been with them in the house all along. The realization hit him like a punch to the stomach. The thing in the closet, the feeling of being watched, the shadows that seemed to shift with each passing night. It was all connected, but he didn't know how or why. He needed to get answers. He needed to know what had happened to the families who lived here before. Scene 4. The weight of knowledge. As the evening wore on, Mark found himself pacing the living room, his mind spinning with the horror he had uncovered. He couldn't stop thinking about the photographs, the distorted figures that had followed those families, their presence lingering like an unspoken threat. What had happened to them? Where had they gone? The night was falling fast, the last of the daylight disappearing behind the thick clouds that had rolled in. The house felt colder, its walls pressing in closer with every passing second. Mark could hear the wind howling outside, the sound of branches scratching against the window. But there was something else, something he couldn't shake. The whispering. It started softly at first, just a faint rustling sound. But soon it grew louder, more insistent, until it was almost deafening. The wind had died down, but the whispers remained, echoing through the house as if coming from the very walls themselves. Mark froze, his blood running cold. He stood still, straining to hear the source. But it wasn't coming from outside. It wasn't the wind. It was coming from inside the house. He turned slowly toward the hallway, toward Ethan's room. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack he could see a faint light flickering. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, and with them, a voice, a low, guttural voice spoke. "Come closer." Mark felt his legs turn to stone. He couldn't move. The house seemed to be closing in around him. He knew he had to go to Ethan, but every fibre of his being screamed at him to turn and run. But he couldn't. Not this time. With trembling hands, he reached for the door, pushed it open, and stepped into the dark hallway. Chapter summary. In Chapter 4, Mark's sense of dread reaches a new height as he uncovers disturbing truths about the house's history. The discovery of old photographs showing distorted, ghostly figures connected to the previous families who lived there sends a wave of terror through Mark. The shadows in the pictures are not just mere tricks of light. They are something darker, something malevolent. As Mark tries to make sense of the connection between these figures and the unsettling events surrounding Ethan, the house grows more oppressive. The whispers that fill the air are the final, terrifying reminder that they are not alone. Chapter 5. The Closet. The house had become a prison. Each morning, Mark awoke to the same oppressive silence. The rooms were still too still, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. He would go through the motions of starting the day, preparing breakfast, checking on Ethan. But it felt like moving through a dream. The house wasn't alive, but it felt as if it was watching. Ethan, meanwhile, had become a shadow of himself. His once bright, inquisitive eyes were now dull and unfocused. The boy barely spoke, and when he did, it was in fragments, mumbled half-sentences about the lightning, about the shadows, about something lurking in the dark corners of their home. Mark had tried to comfort him, but nothing seemed to reach the child anymore. It was as though Ethan was no longer fully present in the world around him, as though his mind had begun to slip away, inch by inch, into the same darkness that seemed to pervade the house. The nightmares were the worst part. Ethan had always been prone to vivid dreams, but now his nights were filled with thrashing, screaming, and crying out for help. Mark would wake to hear his son's pleas, the desperation in his voice sending shivers of terror down his spine. The worst part was that Ethan never remembered his nightmares. In the morning, when Mark asked about them, Ethan would simply shrug, eyes glazed over, and mutter, "It's nothing, Dad, just lightning." But Mark knew better now. It wasn't nothing. It wasn't just his son's overactive imagination. It was something real, something that had burrowed its way into their lives, into their very souls. And it wasn't going away. Mark couldn't sleep anymore, not properly. His mind was clouded with fear, with the horrible realization that the house wasn't just haunted, it was alive. There was something in the walls, in the corners of every room, waiting, watching, whispering. It moved when they weren't looking, scratching at the edges of his sanity. It was as though the house itself was breathing, expanding and contracting with the pulse of some dark entity that Mark couldn't yet understand. And then, one night, it happened again. Scene 1. The noises in the night. Mark had been sitting in the living room, staring at the blank TV screen, trying to block out the noise. His mind was a tangle of thoughts, none of them making sense. He had just finished another round of searching the house, checking every corner, every closet, every crevice for some sign of what was going on. But he found nothing. The house was empty, silent, or so it seemed. As he sat there, the house groaned, an odd, unsettling sound that seemed to come from deep within the foundation. The walls rattled, and for a moment, Mark thought he heard the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open. His breath caught in his throat. He stood up abruptly, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned toward the hallway, his mind racing. The closet. The whispers had been coming from there. The scratching, the murmurs. Mark's eyes darted toward the hallway where Ethan's room was. The door was ajar, the faintest sliver of light peeking through. But there was no sound coming from within. No voice, no movement. Don't go in there, Mark thought. But his body moved against his will. He had to know. He had to know what was happening to his son. To the house. He couldn't live like this anymore. With hesitant steps, Mark walked down the hallway, the floorboards creaking under his weight. He reached Ethan's room and stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the sight before him. Ethan was lying in bed, his back to the door, completely still. The shadows in the room seemed to press closer to him, swirling like dark smoke. But Ethan remained oblivious. The soft scratching returned, now louder than ever. It was coming from the closet. Mark felt his breath catch in his throat as he approached the closet. The door was cracked open, just a small gap, but through the dim light, he could see the outline of something inside. Something that shouldn't have been there. "Ethan?" Mark's voice was a mere whisper, hoarse from the fear that was slowly choking him. "Ethan, wake up." But Ethan didn't stir. Mark reached out for the closet door, his hand trembling as he gripped the cold handle. The room seemed to grow colder, the air thick with dread. He opened the door, his mind screaming at him to turn around and leave, but his body refused to obey. Inside the closet, there was nothing at first, just empty shelves and clothes hanging in the dark. But as Mark's eyes adjusted to the dim light, he saw it. A figure. Not a human figure, but something more. Wrong. It was standing in the farthest corner of the closet, blending with the shadows, its form almost indistinguishable from the darkness itself. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed faintly in the dark, flickering like dying embers. Mark froze, his blood running cold. He could feel its presence, like ice crawling down his spine. It was watching him, and it was waiting. Waiting for what? The scratching sound grew louder, now accompanied by a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from within the walls themselves. Mark's chest tightened. He took a step back, his legs trembling beneath him. "Ethan!" Mark shouted, turning to his son, but Ethan remained still, as though he couldn't hear his father. As though he was gone. Suddenly the figure in the closet moved. It shifted forward, so quickly that Mark barely had time to react. But just as it reached the edge of the closet, something pulled it back into the shadows. Mark stumbled backward, heart racing, as the door slammed shut with a force that shook the entire house. The growling continued, low and menacing, echoing through the house like a warning. Scene 2. A search for answers. The next day, Mark couldn't sit still. His mind was a whirlwind of terror, each thought spinning faster than the last. He couldn't shake the image of the thing in the closet, the way it had moved, the way it had looked at him with those burning eyes. It was as if it knew him, as if it had been waiting for him to discover it. Ethan was still silent. The boy hadn't spoken a word all morning. His eyes glazed over as if he was somewhere far away. Mark had tried to engage him, to get him to talk about what had happened in the closet, but Ethan only shook his head and turned away. Mark needed answers. He needed to understand what was happening. So, he took it upon himself to investigate the house further, to search for anything that could explain the horrors that had begun to invade their lives. He went into the attic again, the place that had always seemed off to him, and began to dig through the old boxes and papers. He found nothing at first, just the usual assortment of forgotten items, old furniture covered in dust, and the remnants of past lives. But as he shifted a box to the side, his hand brushed against something cold. It was a photograph. Mark pulled it from the pile and held it up to the light. It was a faded black and white image of a family, 2 adults and a young girl, standing in front of the house. Their faces were cheerful, smiling as if they hadn't a care in the world. But in the background, just behind the family, something was wrong. A shadow, long and thin, loomed over them, stretching across the ground, its outline distorted and unnatural. It was no trick of the light. It was a presence, a form that was too large to be human. Mark's breath hitched. This photo was old, too old, but the house in the background was unmistakable. It was the same house they were living in now, the same walls, the same windows. But the figure in the background, it was the same one that had watched him in the closet. He couldn't breathe. He felt the walls closing in on him. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and whatever had been inside it before wasn't gone. It was still here, waiting. Darusam Scene 3. The dreadful discovery. That night, Mark couldn't bring himself to sleep. He spent hours pacing the house, checking and rechecking every door and window, making sure everything was locked. But every time he glanced down the hallway, he swore he saw something moving at the edges of his vision. Something tall, thin, and lurking just out of sight. The whispers had returned louder now. They were coming from the walls. They were coming from inside the house. Suddenly, a loud crash shattered the silence. Mark froze, his blood turning to ice. It came from upstairs, from Ethan's room. Mark bolted toward the stairs, his feet pounding against the wooden floor. As he reached the landing, he felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over him. The house was darker now, the shadows deeper, more oppressive. And in the distance, he heard it, the soft, unmistakable sound of someone, or something, scratching at the door. His breath quickened. The closet. He threw open the door to Ethan's room, but it was empty. The bed was undisturbed, and the window was still shut tight. The room felt cold, colder than it had ever been. Then, as he turned to check the closet, a voice, a whisper, rose from the dark corner. "Come closer." Mark's heart slammed against his ribs. The door to the closet was ajar, the darkness inside it thicker than ever before. He took a step forward, his body betraying him as he reached for the door, and then he saw it, a shadow moving inside just beyond the threshold, and in the darkness, glowing faintly, were two eyes. Mark reached into the darkness, pulling the door open fully, his mind screaming at him to stop, but it was too late. Inside the closet there was no clothing, no shelves, no boxes, just a swirling, endless darkness. And in the center of it, crouched low to the ground, was a figure not human, its face just visible, stretched into a grotesque, mocking grin. And from the shadow, it spoke. "You shouldn't have opened the door." The chapter summary. In Chapter 5, Mark's investigation into the supernatural events surrounding the house takes a terrifying turn. As he tries to confront the source of the terror, the truth becomes more elusive, and the boundaries between reality and nightmare begin to blur. The appearance of an unnatural figure, both in photographs and in the shadows, signals the house's malevolent presence. Mark's search for answers leads him to an even darker discovery as the malevolent entity grows bolder. This chapter deepens the mystery, heightening the tension and fear as Mark and Ethan find themselves trapped in a living nightmare that refuses to let them escape. Chapter 6. The presence in the walls. The house had never felt alive, until now. Mark couldn't escape it. No matter how hard he tried to shut it out, the suffocating atmosphere of the house pressed down on him with increasing intensity. The walls groaned as if the house itself was breathing, shifting, stirring with something dark that was hiding just beneath the surface. The unsettling presence that had clung to Ethan since the first night they arrived had now wrapped itself around Mark like an iron vice, squeezing, tightening, suffocating. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it was hungry. The last few days had been a blur. Mark had tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy for Ethan's sake, but the boy had grown distant, his once bright eyes clouded over with something darker, something Mark couldn't understand. Ethan had stopped speaking altogether, his eyes often flickering toward the corners of the rooms, as if waiting for something to appear. He spent his days hiding in his room, and when he did emerge, it was only to stare at the walls as if they were whispering secrets to him. Mark, meanwhile, had become obsessed with the house. He couldn't sleep. His nights were filled with restlessness, and his days were spent searching through old documents and photographs he had found in the attic, looking for answers. He had to understand what was happening to them, to Ethan, but the more he searched, the deeper the darkness seemed to grow. Scene 1. The noise beneath it was late, just past midnight, when Mark heard it again, the scraping. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. It wasn't anything normal. The scraping sound had started weeks ago, faint at first, like a distant rat chewing at the walls, but now it was louder, more insistent. It was as if something or someone was clawing at the very foundation of the house. Mark had tried to ignore it, thinking it was just his imagination, the product of too many sleepless nights. But tonight, it was unbearable. He stood frozen in his bedroom, staring at the wall. His heartbeat echoed in his ears as the sound reverberated through the house, louder than before. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It wasn't random anymore. It had a rhythm, an almost deliberate pace. The sound seemed to crawl through the walls, moving from one side of the room to the other. Mark's breath quickened as the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He couldn't move, couldn't think. He was paralyzed with fear. There's something in the walls, he thought, his mind racing. Something's trying to get out. Without realizing it, Mark had moved toward the source of the sound, the wall directly opposite his bed. The scratching was louder now, almost deafening, like something was trying to burrow its way through the plaster. Mark felt a sickening knot form in his stomach. He placed his hand on the wall, his fingers trembling. The moment his palm made contact, the sound stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the noise itself. It was as if the house was holding its breath, waiting. Mark's pulse thrummed in his ears, and he slowly drew his hand away from the wall, eyes darting around the room. The quiet was suffocating, pressing down on him, almost like a physical force. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. A soft shuffle came from the hallway outside his door. Mark spun toward the sound. His heart skipped a beat when he saw Ethan standing in the doorway, his pale face framed by the dim light from the hallway. The boy was barefoot, his clothes disheveled, his hair hanging in his eyes. His gaze was vacant, distant, as if he wasn't really there. "Ethan." Mark's voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. "What are you doing up?" The boy didn't answer. He simply stood there, his body rigid, his eyes staring past Mark, focused on something invisible in the dark room. The silence between them stretched long, unbearable. Then, in a voice that was barely audible, Ethan spoke. "They're in the walls, Dad. They're waiting." Mark felt the floor shift beneath him. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of something unspeakable. He wanted to reach for Ethan, to pull him into his arms and make him safe again. But the look in his son's eyes stopped him. There was no recognition, no warmth, just the emptiness of a child lost in a nightmare. Suddenly, the scraping came again. It wasn't coming from the walls this time. It was coming from below. Scene 2. The basement. The basement. Mark had avoided it since they moved in. The door to the basement had always been slightly ajar, and the stairs leading down were steep and dark, the wooden steps creaking beneath the slightest touch. There was something about that door, something about the way the darkness behind it seemed to reach out. But now, the sound was coming from there, the same rhythmic scratching. It was louder than ever, almost frantic, as though whatever was in the walls was trying to escape. Mark's heart raced as he turned toward the hallway, his eyes fixed on the door to the basement. Ethan's voice broke through his thoughts. "Don't go down there. Please, don't." Mark turned to see his son standing motionless, his expression blank, as if he hadn't moved in minutes. His body trembled slightly, the only sign of life in his otherwise still frame. "Ethan," Mark whispered, his voice breaking. "We need to figure out what's going on. I need to go down there." "No, Dad," Ethan said, his voice shaking now. "They're waiting. They're in the dark and they're hungry." Mark didn't know what to do. He was torn between the desperate need to protect his son and the nagging sense that something had to be done. He couldn't just sit there and wait for the house to consume them both. Whatever was happening, whatever was in the walls, was more than just a haunting. It was something worse, something that had been waiting. With a final, painful glance at Ethan, Mark turned toward the basement door. He could hear the scratching now, growing louder, more frantic. He reached for the door handle, his fingers cold with sweat, and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing the pitch-black stairs leading down into the unknown. The air in the basement was thick and stale, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. Mark swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath as he stepped onto the first step. It groaned under his weight, the sound amplified by the silence. The stairs seemed to stretch on forever, leading deeper into the suffocating darkness below. As he descended, the scratching grew louder, more frantic, until it filled his ears like a symphony of claws dragging across the walls. It wasn't just one thing anymore. There were multiple sounds, coming from all directions. Mark's heart raced as he continued down, the walls on either side of him now seeming to close in. At the bottom of the stairs, Mark reached for the light switch. His hand trembled as he flipped it on. The light flickered and buzzed before illuminating the cramped, cold space. What he saw made his blood run cold. The basement was alive. The walls were covered in deep gouges, marks that looked as though something had been trying to escape for years. Scratches and slashes carved deep into the plaster, some so deep they exposed the wooden beams beneath. The floor was stained with something dark, almost black, as though the earth itself had been soaked in blood. And in the far corner, pressed against the wall, was something that made Mark's stomach churn. A figure, not a person, something else. It was crouched down, its limbs twisted unnaturally, its eyes glowing with a sickly green hue. The thing's mouth was wide, a grotesque grin stretching across its face, its teeth jagged and sharp, like the shards of broken glass. It wasn't human. It was far worse. Mark took an instinctual step back, but the figure moved, slithering across the floor toward him. Its movements were unnatural, jerky, as though it was struggling to hold itself together. The scratching continued, louder now, as if it were coming from multiple sources, dozens of unseen figures, all closing in on him from every side. "Dad!" Ethan's voice echoed from the top of the stairs. Mark didn't dare look away from the thing in front of him. "They're in the walls, Dad." The creature's eyes locked onto Mark's, and in that instant, it hissed, the sound high-pitched and shrill like nails on a chalkboard. It reached toward him with its spindly fingers, its claws scraping against the stone floor, the stench of decay flooding the air. Mark's chest tightened, the fear consuming him. He had to escape. He had to get out of there. But as he turned to flee, the door to the basement slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping him inside. Scene 3. The struggle panic surged through Mark as he pounded on the basement door, his fists desperate against the wood. The house was alive now, its walls closing in on him. The creature behind him was still making that awful hissing sound. Its movements slow, deliberate. It was playing with him. Mark's breath came in shallow, desperate gasps as he pulled at the door again, but it wouldn't budge. His mind raced. Think, think, think. There had to be a way out. He turned back toward the thing, which was now standing in the center of the room, watching him with those glowing eyes. Its grin widened, and it took a step forward. A sudden, sickening crack echoed through the room as it stretched its limbs unnaturally, the bones in its arms popping out of their sockets. Mark's heart hammered in his chest. He could feel the presence growing stronger now, as though the creature was feeding off his fear. He tried to steady his breath, but it was impossible. The walls were closing in on him, the shadows shifting as if they had minds of their own. The scratching in the walls grew louder, now joined by the sound of muffled whispers, calling his name. "Mark! Mark!" the voices hissed. "Come closer!" Mark couldn't take it anymore. His pulse roared in his ears as he turned toward the stairs. He had to escape. He had to survive. With a final frantic push, he wrenched open the basement door, stumbling up the stairs, his legs weak with terror. The creature's hiss followed him, but Mark didn't dare look back. He didn't dare take a breath until he reached the safety of the main floor. But as he slammed the door shut behind him, locking it tight, the whispers didn't stop. They followed him, and the walls were still alive. Chapter Summary. In Chapter 6, Mark's descent into the house's terrifying secrets continues as the supernatural force grows stronger. The walls seem to come alive, scratching and scraping as if something is trying to escape. Mark confronts the sinister figure in the basement, only to realize that the house is more than just haunted. It's a living, breathing entity, feeding off fear. The tension escalates as Mark is trapped and confronted with the unimaginable horrors lurking in the shadows. This chapter further deepens the psychological and physical terror Mark faces as he begins to realize that he might not survive the nightmare he and his son have been drawn into. Chapter 7. The Unseen Terror. Mark had never been a superstitious man. He had always prided himself on being a rational thinker, someone who could explain away the unexplainable, the creaks of the house, the odd draft, the flickering of lights. Those were just the quirks of an old building settling into place. But the events of the past week had shattered his sense of logic. Nothing made sense anymore, and yet everything felt disturbingly real. The figure in the basement, the scratching in the walls, Ethan's increasingly erratic behavior. It was all real. He could feel it, in his bones. The house was alive. It was feeding off them, and it was only a matter of time before it claimed them entirely. Mark had spent hours poring over every old document he could find in the house, reading about the previous owners and their strange disappearances, the rumors of strange lights and voices. But the more he read, the less sense it all made. There was no clear explanation, no pattern, just death, unexplained, terrifying and sudden. And then there was Ethan. Ethan had stopped speaking altogether. He barely ate, barely slept, and when he did sleep, it was fitful, full of whispered cries and thrashing. Mark had seen his son's eyes, empty, hollow. It was as if the boy was no longer fully present in this world. And whatever was there, the thing that had taken hold of Ethan, it wasn't something Mark could fight with reason or logic. It was something else. Mark had tried everything, comforting Ethan, talking to him, even getting him to see a doctor, but it was useless. The boy would only mutter about the dark things that watched him, the way they followed him through the house, the way they whispered. Every corner, every shadow seemed to have eyes, and every room seemed to be alive with a dark presence. There was no escape. The house was alive, and it was feeding off them. Mark didn't know how much longer he could keep this up. He couldn't let Ethan spiral any further, but he also couldn't escape this suffocating reality. The house was a prison, and they were both trapped inside. Scene 1. The sound in the walls. It was late again. The house was silent, but the silence was a lie. The silence had always been a lie. Mark sat at the kitchen table, his hands trembling as he stared at the empty plate in front of him. His mind was elsewhere, constantly elsewhere. He had barely touched his food that night, his appetite gone. The atmosphere in the house was unbearable. It pressed in on him from all sides, heavy and suffocating. There was a low hum in the air that seemed to vibrate through his very bones, and it was always there, just beneath the surface. The shadows seemed to shift whenever he wasn't looking, curling like serpents ready to strike. He glanced over at the hallway, toward Ethan's room. The door was ajar, but there was no light coming from within. Ethan's room had become a place of dread. The boy hadn't slept in days, and when he did, he slept fitfully, his dreams twisted and full of monsters. The shadows that filled his room at night were no longer his to control. They belonged to something else now. Suddenly, a sound broke through the quiet, a faint scratching noise, barely audible, like nails dragging across wood. Mark's heart skipped a beat. His eyes snapped to the walls of the kitchen, but they were silent again. He waited, his breath held in anticipation, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. There it was again. Scrape. 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 It was coming from the walls, from behind them. The sound was so faint, so subtle, that it was almost impossible to be sure it was real. But it was real. It had to be. Mark stood up, his knees weak with the sudden surge of fear. He crossed the kitchen in slow, hesitant steps. The scraping was louder now. It was coming from the walls. It was in the walls. He could feel it. Mark reached out to touch the wall. The wood was cold to the touch, colder than it should have been. The scraping grew louder as his fingers made contact. It was as though something was trying to dig its way out. Mark recoiled, his chest tightening with a sense of dread. The sound stopped abruptly. Mark's breath caught in his throat. What is this? He quickly turned and headed toward the stairs, his mind racing. The wall in the kitchen felt like it was alive, like something was trapped inside it, something hungry. The stairs creaked beneath his weight as he ascended. But Mark didn't pause to listen. He needed to check on Ethan. He needed to see if his son was all right. When he reached the top of the stairs, he hesitated. The door to Ethan's room was ajar, but there was no sound from within, no movement. Mark felt the weight of his fear grow heavier in his chest as he stepped closer. Ethan? His voice was soft but loud enough to be heard in the stillness. Ethan, are you okay? There was no response. Mark gently pushed open the door. The room was dark, the curtains drawn tight, blocking out the faint light of the moon. His eyes slowly adjusted to the darkness, and then he saw him. Ethan, sitting on the floor, his back to the door. He was completely still, his legs drawn up to his chest, his hands wrapped tightly around his knees. The boy didn't move. His head was down, his hair hanging in front of his face. Ethan? Mark asked again, this time stepping closer. Suddenly, Ethan's head snapped up. His eyes were wide, too wide. The pupils dilated to an unnatural size. Mark felt his stomach twist with terror. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. Ethan's voice came out in a raspy whisper. "It's coming, Dad. It's in the walls. It's coming for us." Mark's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about, Ethan?" "They're in the walls. They're watching," Ethan said, his voice trembling. "They're waiting for us." Mark's mind raced. He had to do something. He had to protect Ethan. The fear that had been gnawing at him for weeks, months perhaps, was now palpable, pressing in on him like a vice. He had to stop it. Whatever was in the house, whatever had taken hold of Ethan, it had to end. Sathi Famulu Scene 2. The Search for Truth. Mark spent the next few days searching the house for answers. But no matter how much he searched, no matter how much he dug into the history of the house and the families who had lived there before, the truth eluded him. Every corner of the house seemed to hide something dark, something that watched him. The attic, the basement, the rooms where the shadows seemed to linger. There was no escape from it. He couldn't get the image of Ethan's wide, terror-filled eyes out of his mind. The boy had never been this scared. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was desperation. The house was breaking Ethan down, turning him into something else. Mark didn't know how much longer he could protect him. As Mark entered the kitchen one evening, he noticed something strange. The wall, where the scratching had come from, was different. The wood wasn't as smooth as before. It was warped, discolored, as though something was pressing against it from the inside. Mark took a deep breath and reached out to touch it. The moment his fingers made contact, the wall shuddered beneath his touch, as though something inside was moving. A loud crash came from the other side, followed by a shrill, inhuman scream. Mark jumped back, his heart leaping in his throat. It was coming from the basement. Without thinking, Mark rushed toward the basement door. It was locked, but the key was on the counter. He had kept it there for safekeeping, just in case. His hands shook as he grabbed the key and inserted it into the lock. The door creaked open slowly, and the air that hit him was thick with the scent of decay. It was cold, too cold. As Mark descended into the darkness, the feeling of dread intensified. The air seemed to press in on him, heavy and thick, as though the house itself was suffocating. The darkness stretched on forever, and the only sound was his own ragged breath, the beating of his heart in his chest. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, he flicked on the light. The bulb buzzed, flickering in and out before casting a dim glow over the room. The basement was smaller than he remembered, its walls lined with boxes and old furniture. But there was something different about it now. The shadows were deeper here, more pronounced. And there, in the corner of the room, was the faint outline of something, or someone, standing in the dark. Mark froze. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It was simply there, a presence in the shadows. He couldn't see its face, but he could feel its eyes, burning into him, watching. And then the voice came, a low, guttural whisper that echoed through the room. "You shouldn't have come down here." Mark's blood ran cold. He had no words. His body refused to move as the figure took a step forward, revealing itself in the faint light. The figure was not human. It was something else, tall and thin, with long, spindly arms and a face that seemed to melt in and out of existence, a twisted mask of darkness. Its eyes were wide, glowing with an otherworldly light, and as it stepped closer, Mark realized with a sickening jolt of terror that the figure was not alone. It was never alone. Chapter Summary. In Chapter 7, Mark's investigation into the house's dark forces continues, and the truth becomes more horrifying with each passing moment. The presence in the walls, the whispers, and the nightmarish figures all come together in a terrifying revelation. The house is alive, and it's not just haunting them, it's feeding on them. As Mark descends into the basement, he comes face to face with the horrifying reality that there is no escaping this nightmare. The terror escalates as the house's true nature is revealed, leaving Mark and Ethan trapped in a waking hell with no escape. Chapter 8. The Hunger Within. The silence in the house was thick, like a suffocating fog that pressed against Mark's chest, making it hard to breathe. The longer he stayed in the house, the more it felt like the walls were closing in, the air growing heavier with every passing minute. The house wasn't just old and decaying. It was alive, and it was feeding on them. The more Mark tried to escape, the more trapped he felt, like a rat in a maze, running but never finding the exit. The presence that haunted the house had grown stronger. It was no longer just a whisper in the walls or a shadow in the corner of his vision. It was real. It was here, and it was getting closer. Mark hadn't slept in days. The nightmares had started to bleed into his waking hours, the line between what was real and what was not growing thinner with each passing second. He couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching him constantly, waiting for him to make a mistake, to slip, to give in. Ethan's condition had worsened. The boy's eyes, once full of life, had become hollow, his body pale and frail, as though something was draining the very life out of him. He hadn't spoken a word in days, but Mark could see the terror in his son's eyes. Ethan was terrified, not just of the house, but of himself, as though whatever dark force had taken hold of the house was now taking hold of him as well. Mark didn't know what to do. Every time he tried to talk to Ethan, the boy would simply stare at him, his eyes wide and unblinking, as though seeing something Mark couldn't. The whispers in the house had grown louder, more insistent, and now Mark could hear them even in his own mind. They were calling to him. Scene 1. The dark things in the walls. The house was suffocating him. Mark felt the weight of it pressing on him, felt it in his chest every time he entered a room, every time he stepped down the creaky hallway. The house knew him now, and it had taken an interest in him. He could feel its eyes, hidden, watching, waiting. It was always there, always waiting. One night, Mark stood in front of the wall in the living room, his hand pressed against it as he felt the vibrations beneath the surface. The same scratching noise had returned, louder now, as if something was clawing its way toward him, something trapped inside the house, begging to be set free. It was almost a voice, low and guttural, as though the very walls were speaking to him. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, a chill so cold that Mark's breath became visible in the air. The scratching grew more frantic, and Mark's hand trembled against the wall, his fingers itching to pull away, but his body refused to obey. There was something inside the walls, something alive. He jerked his hand away and stepped back, his heart hammering in his chest. The air around him felt thick, oppressive, as if the house itself was watching him, waiting for him to make his move. The scratching was louder now, almost deafening, and Mark could feel the walls shaking under the pressure. With shaking hands, Mark grabbed a nearby chair and slammed it into the wall. The sound of wood hitting plaster reverberated through the room, and for a moment, the scratching stopped. But then it began again, even louder, faster. Mark's pulse quickened as he realized that the thing inside the wall wasn't trying to get out. It was coming for him. He stepped back, his eyes darting around the room. The walls had become alive, pulsing, moving, as though they were breathing with him. He was no longer alone. The thing inside the walls, whatever it was coming for him, and it was closer than he realized. Suddenly the scratching stopped, and the silence that followed was deafening. Mark's breath came in short, ragged gasps as he tried to make sense of what was happening. Then, without warning, the lights flickered, they dimmed, and the room was plunged into darkness. Mark's heart raced. He reached for the light switch, his hand trembling, but before he could flip it back on, he heard something that made his blood run cold. A voice. It was faint at first, barely a whisper, but it grew louder, clearer, until Mark could hear it echoing in the dark room. The voice wasn't his own. It wasn't Ethan's. It was something else, something wrong. "You shouldn't have opened the door." Mark froze, his heart pounding in his ears. The voice wasn't just in the room. It was in his head. He could hear it inside his mind, calling to him, pulling him deeper into the house, deeper into the dark that surrounded them. He spun around, his eyes searching the room, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the oppressive dark. The silence had returned, but it was a silence full of expectation, as though something was waiting for him to make the next move. Scene 2, the thing in the closet. Mark didn't know how much longer he could take it. The house had begun to feel like a living, breathing thing. Its walls were alive with whispers, its floors shaking with the footsteps of things unseen. The walls were crawling with something, someone, and it was coming for them. Mark turned away from the wall, his breath shallow as he crossed the room toward Ethan's bedroom. He had to check on the boy. He had to make sure he was still him. When Mark opened the door, the darkness inside seemed to swallow him whole. Ethan was sitting on the bed just like before, his back to the door, his body still as stone. The boy didn't move, didn't even acknowledge Mark's presence. His eyes were open, but they were empty, hollow, lost. "Ethan," Mark whispered, his voice trembling as he walked toward the bed. He crouched beside his son, gently lifting his chin, but when their eyes met, Mark's breath caught in his throat. Ethan's eyes were wide, but they weren't Ethan's eyes. They were dark, dark like the house itself, filled with shadows that shouldn't exist. "Dad," Ethan whispered, his voice hollow and distant. "They're here. They're inside me now." Mark recoiled, a sickening dread washing over him. The words didn't sound like Ethan. They sounded like something else. Something that had taken hold of his son. Mark's voice cracked as he tried to reach his son. "Ethan, please look at me. We'll get out of here. I'll get you out. Just talk to me." But Ethan didn't respond. Instead, he turned his head slowly toward the closet. Mark's gaze followed, and for the first time, he noticed that the door was slightly ajar. The shadows behind it were darker than before. Thicker. Something was inside. The scratching started again, soft at first, but then it grew louder. It wasn't coming from the walls anymore. It was coming from the closet. Mark's heart raced as he stood up, his legs shaking beneath him. He knew what he had to do. He had to face whatever was inside the closet. He had to confront it. But the thought of opening that door, of stepping into that darkness, sent a wave of nausea over him. "Dad." Ethan's voice was a whisper now, a low, trembling sound. "They want me. They want me." Mark's hands were clammy as he reached for the closet door. His breath hitched in his throat as he slowly pulled it open, the darkness beyond seeming to swallow the light of the room. The scratching stopped. The room fell silent, the kind of silence that rang in your ears, suffocating, unnatural. Mark stood frozen, staring into the darkness, waiting for something, anything, to move. And then he saw it. A figure. It was barely visible, shrouded in darkness, its form twisting in and out of focus. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs long and spindly, bent at unnatural angles. The face was obscured, but Mark could feel its eyes, boring into him, into his soul. The thing stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like something out of a nightmare. Mark stepped back, but the thing was faster. It reached out with its long, bony fingers and grabbed him by the arm. Mark screamed, his voice cracking with terror, but no sound came out. The thing pulled him forward, its grip like iron, dragging him into the closet, into the dark. "Dad!" Ethan's voice screamed from behind him, but it was distant now, faint, as though he was already lost. Mark's breath came in ragged gasps as the darkness closed in around him. He could feel the cold, the suffocating cold, pressing against him. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The thing was pulling him deeper, dragging him into the blackness. And then he saw it. In the farthest corner of the closet, the thing in the walls. It was waiting for him. Scene 3. The last breath. Mark felt his chest tighten, his body screaming for air. The darkness pressed in on him, suffocating him, and the whispers started again. They filled the air, coming from everywhere, echoing in his mind. "You should have left." The voice was cold, so cold that it pierced his bones. "You should have stayed away." Mark struggled, but the thing's grip tightened, its fingers digging into his flesh. The shadows closed in around him, smothering him with their weight. The walls were alive now, pulsing, breathing, as if the house itself was alive and hungry. "Come closer." Mark's breath caught in his throat as the darkness grew. He was no longer sure where the closet ended and the darkness began. His vision blurred, his thoughts fractured. And then he heard Ethan's voice, clear, like a bell ringing through the chaos. "Dad, help me." Mark's vision went black. Chapter summary. In Chapter 8, Mark's descent into the house's terrifying grip deepens. The house is no longer just a place, it is a living entity, and it is feeding on them. the scratching sounds in the walls, the chilling presence in the closet, and Ethan's possession by the house all point to a horrifying truth. The house is alive, and it wants them. The chapter builds to a harrowing climax as Mark confronts the malevolent force head-on, only to be pulled into the depths of darkness alongside his son. The tension reaches unbearable heights, and Mark's struggle to protect Ethan becomes a battle for survival against an insidious ancient evil. Chapter 9. The Hollow. The house had grown silent again, but it was a silence laced with menace, a silence that felt like a trap, like the calm before the storm. Mark could hear his own heartbeat echoing in his ears, each beat a reminder that time was running out. The house was alive, he knew that now. And it wasn't just the house, it was them too. It was inside of them, consuming them from the inside out. Ethan's absence from the waking world had been growing more pronounced. The boy's fragile body had seemed to waste away before Mark's eyes. The dark circles beneath his eyes had grown deeper, and his once bright eyes now seemed glassy, as though his soul was fading into the shadows. Mark had tried everything. He had shouted, begged, and even resorted to desperate measures, but nothing seemed to reach Ethan. It was as though the boy had already been claimed, by the house, by whatever unspeakable force had taken root in their home. Mark was alone now. The whispering voices had stopped, but Mark could still feel them, lurking just beneath the surface of his thoughts, waiting for the right moment to surface again. He had tried to barricade himself and Ethan in the upstairs rooms, but the house had other plans. Every night the floorboards seemed to tremble underfoot, as if something was moving beneath them, something vast and hungry. Mark couldn't remember the last time he had slept. Time had lost all meaning, days blurred together, merging into one long nightmare. He was exhausted, but the fear gnawed at him, keeping his eyes wide open long into the night. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint sound that came from the dark corners of the house sent his pulse into overdrive. Something was watching him, something that wasn't human. And Ethan had changed. He no longer spoke. His body was like a shell, empty and frail, no longer the child Mark had once known. But his eyes, those eyes, still held something, a flicker of recognition, of remembrance. They had once been full of life, but now they were hollow. Mark could feel his sanity slipping away, piece by piece. He didn't know how much longer he could stay in the house. Every time he tried to leave, every time he reached the door, something inside the house stopped him. It was as if the house itself wasn't done with him yet. And then, one night, it happened again. Scene 1. The Return of the Shadow. Mark had been sitting in the living room trying to keep his mind from unraveling when the temperature in the room dropped. His breath misted in the air, and for the briefest of moments, he could see his own exhalation swirling in the dim light. The room, once bathed in the soft glow of the lamplight, now felt heavy and cold, like an open grave. It started as a faint sound, an almost imperceptible rustling, like the brushing of fabric against the floor. Mark stood up, his heart beginning to race. He moved toward the hallway, the faintest sensation of being watched crawling up his spine. The air in the house was thick, pressing against him with every step. As he reached the doorway, the sound intensified. The rustling became a dragging, scraping noise, as if something was dragging itself across the floor. Mark's heart thundered in his chest as his pulse quickened, every instinct telling him to turn back, to run. But something compelled him to move forward. Something dark and insistent that tugged at him, like invisible hands pulling him deeper into the nightmare. He moved down the hallway toward the stairs, each step echoing in the empty space. The closer he got to the bottom of the stairs, the louder the scraping became. The sound filled the house now, reverberating from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. It was coming from below. Mark reached the door to the basement. It was ajar, as if inviting him in, as if it knew he was coming. The air that escaped from the crack was colder than ever, and it smelled stale, like rot. Mark hesitated, his fingers gripping the cold metal of the door frame. For a moment, everything was still, and then, with a violent rush of sound, the door slammed open on its own. Mark staggered back, his heart in his throat. The room beyond was pitch black. But he could feel it, the suffocating weight of something watching him from the depths of the dark. The scraping continued, louder now, as if someone, was trying to break free from the darkness. Suddenly, Mark felt it. Cold hands, cold and unfeeling, brushing against his neck. He spun around, but there was nothing there. His heart raced, his breath shallow and quick, as he tried to make sense of the sudden panic rising within him. And then he saw it. At the far end of the hallway, a figure stood in the darkness. It was tall, too tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. The figure's face was hidden by shadows, but Mark could see its eyes, glowing faintly, a sickly green, staring back at him from the darkness. The figure didn't move. It didn't need to. Mark felt his legs weaken beneath him. The figure in the hallway seemed to pull at him, like a magnet, drawing him closer, inch by inch, until he couldn't move. He felt rooted to the spot, as though the very air around him had thickened, made solid. The shadows began to twist, warping in unnatural ways, like they were alive. He had to get to Ethan. He had to save him before it was too late. But the figure moved. It stepped forward, its body stretching, twisting, elongating, until it was impossibly tall, impossibly thin, its limbs bent at strange angles, joints popping with a sickening crack. Mark gasped, his breath catching in his throat. The figure's eyes never left him. It was close now, too close. "Help me," a voice whispered. But it wasn't Mark's voice. It wasn't Ethan's either. It was the voice of something ancient, something dark, something inhuman. The figure stepped closer, its face still obscured by the shadows, but Mark could hear the rasp of its breath, feel its icy presence pressing against him. "Come to me!" the voice hissed again. "Come closer!" Mark fought against the paralyzing fear that gripped him. He had to move, had to get to Ethan. With all the strength he had left, he turned and ran, stumbling, gasping for air, toward his son's room. But as he reached the door, he froze. Ethan was standing there. But it wasn't Ethan. Not anymore. His son stood motionless, his back to Mark, his body unnaturally still. And in the darkness, Mark saw it. Those same glowing eyes. The figure had taken him. Ethan's voice was no longer his own. It was hollow, echoing in Mark's mind, like 1,000 voices all speaking in unison. "They are here, Dad. They are inside me now." Mark's chest constricted as he tried to reach out to Ethan, but as his hand brushed the boy's shoulder, a cold wave of terror flooded through him. The boy's skin was as cold as ice, and his body was rigid, like stone. "Ethan?" Mark's voice broke. But the boy didn't move. His eyes locked onto Mark's, and they weren't Ethan's eyes anymore. They were something else, something empty, something twisted. The figure that had been in the hallway stepped behind Ethan. It was invisible now, blending into the shadows, but Mark could feel its presence. He could feel it breathing down his neck. He could hear the scraping again, this time from the walls, the floor, the ceiling, all of it moving toward him. It was closing in. Mark backed away, his mind racing, his heart pounding in his chest. His legs were like jelly, his body trembling with the weight of the fear that was crushing him. There was no escape. But then something snapped. The figure in front of him, the thing that had taken Ethan, began to move. Scene 2. The horrible truth. Mark's mind whirled as he watched the figure twist, stretch, and contort before him. It was no longer humanoid, no longer something he could comprehend. It was a mass of shadows, a thing that defied all logic, a creature made of darkness that moved with unnatural speed. Its eyes glowed with a sickly green light that seemed to burn through him, like it was seeing into his very soul. It took a step toward him, and Mark's body reacted before his mind could catch up. He spun around and bolted for the stairs. His breath came in ragged gasps as he ran through the dark hallway, every corner seeming to close in on him. The house seemed to groan in response, as if it were alive, as if it were laughing. The walls bent inward, twisting, contorting in ways that shouldn't have been possible, and the shadows reached out to grab him. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were deafening. Mark could feel the pressure of them, like claws scraping against his mind. But he couldn't stop. He couldn't slow down. He had to get out. He had to escape. But every door was locked, every window sealed shut. The house had them trapped. The lights flickered and died as he reached the bottom of the stairs. The house was plunging into total darkness, and Mark felt it, the weight of the darkness that had enveloped him, that had wrapped itself around his very soul. The figure was close now. Its breath was in his ear, its presence suffocating. "You can't escape," it whispered, its voice echoing in his mind. "You never could." Mark stumbled back, but he couldn't run any longer. The darkness was all around him, choking him. It was closing in. The walls were pulsing with a life of their own, breathing, shifting. And in that moment, Mark realized the truth. The house wasn't haunted. It wasn't just a place. It was alive. It had been alive long before they arrived, and it would remain long after they were gone. Mark had never been the first. He would not be the last. The chapter. Summary. In Chapter 9, the terror intensifies as Mark faces the true horror of the house's malevolent presence. The figure in the basement, the voices, and the terrible transformation of Ethan reveal the true nature of the dark force that has consumed them. Mark's struggle for survival against an invisible, unrelenting evil reaches a breaking point as he is drawn into the house's twisted grip. The line between reality and nightmare blurs as Mark realizes the horrifying truth. The house is alive, and it wants them, body and soul. The chapter builds to a chilling climax, setting the stage for the final confrontation with the darkness. Chapter 10. The End of Silence. The house had become a tomb. It wasn't just the isolation. It wasn't just the oppressive air, the suffocating silence, the constant feeling of being watched. It was the sense that the house had won, that it had claimed them, body and soul. Mark could feel it now, deep in his bones. He could feel the house breathing, could feel its heartbeat beneath his feet as it thrummed in time with his own. The house had always been alive. It had been waiting for him and Ethan for this moment, and now it was feeding. The walls closed in around him, and the shadows seemed to stretch farther than they should. Every corner of the house felt wrong. The light flickered and dimmed, casting strange, twisting shapes on the floor, and the air was thick with a sour, metallic smell, like blood or decay. Mark couldn't remember the last time he'd seen daylight, couldn't even remember the last time he'd felt the warmth of the sun. All he knew now was the cold, the darkness, the whispers. "Come closer." It was a voice, but not a voice. It echoed in his head, in his bones, vibrating with power and hunger. It was the same voice that had haunted him for weeks, the voice that had driven him to the edge of madness. It was the voice of the house, of whatever was inside the house, and it was calling to him, drawing him in. Mark had tried to leave. He had tried to escape this nightmare, but the house wouldn't let him. The doors were locked, the windows were sealed, and every time he tried to break through, the walls would shift, would close in, would trap him further inside. The house was a prison, and it was alive, and it was waiting. Ethan had long since stopped speaking. His eyes were hollow now, lost to the darkness, his body a fragile shell of the child he had once been. He had become a puppet, a vessel, and whatever evil that had taken hold of the house had claimed him. It was inside him now, twisting his mind, filling him with shadows. Mark's own sanity was slipping, bit by bit, as the house crept deeper into his soul. Frisasi. Scene 1. The Hollow Child. Mark stood in the living room, staring at the twisted figure of his son. Ethan was sitting on the floor, his legs curled beneath him, his head down, his hair hanging in front of his face. Mark had tried to call to him, to pull him from the depths of whatever nightmare he had fallen into, but nothing seemed to reach him anymore. Ethan's breathing was shallow, too shallow, like he wasn't fully alive, like he was already gone. The boy didn't move as Mark knelt beside him, reaching out with trembling hands. "Ethan," Mark whispered, his voice hoarse. Please come back to me." But Ethan didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on the floor, distant and unblinking. Mark felt his stomach twist as he lifted Ethan's chin, but the boy's face was cold, unnaturally cold, like marble. His eyes, once full of life, were now dark, sunken, hollow. And yet, they still held a presence that Mark couldn't place, something foreign, something wrong. Mark's pulse quickened as his son's lips parted, and for a brief moment, he thought he heard something like a whisper, something soft, something almost tender. "They're here," Ethan muttered, his voice thick with a deep, hollow echo. "The hunger is inside me now." Mark recoiled, his body trembling as he pulled his hands back. His mind screamed at him to run, to leave the room, to escape the presence that was consuming his son. But he couldn't. Ethan's gaze locked onto his, and in that moment, Mark saw it, the truth. Ethan wasn't Ethan anymore. Not really. Something else had taken hold of him, something darker and older than anything Mark had ever imagined. The boy was no longer just possessed. He was a vessel, an unwilling host to something that had been waiting in the shadows for centuries. Mark's breath hitched as Ethan's head tilted slowly to the side, an unnatural jerking movement, like a puppet whose strings had been pulled too tight. The house seemed to exhale around them, a deep, suffocating sigh, as though it were drawing in a breath, waiting for what was to come next. And then Ethan's eyes flickered, and Mark saw the change. The flicker of recognition, the boy's soul, somewhere deep within, trying to fight back against whatever was controlling him. Mark reached out again, his voice soft but urgent. "Ethan, please," he whispered, shaking the boy's shoulder, hoping for a sign, hoping for a glimpse of the child he had loved. For a moment, Ethan's body tensed. And then, he gasped. A horrible, strangled sound, his eyes wide, blinking in confusion. But just as quickly that brief spark of life was gone. The hollow stare returned, and the boy's lips parted, this time with a low, guttural laugh. "It's too late," Ethan whispered, the voice not his own. "It's inside you too." Mark stepped back, his heart slamming in his chest. The words hit him like a cold slap. His mind was racing. Was it possible? Was he already too far gone? Already part of it? The house, the thing inside it, had been feeding on them, on their fear, on their souls. Was Mark already consumed? Before he could process the thought, the room shifted. The walls groaned, bending and creaking as though the house were stretching, shifting, moving like a living creature. The air grew thick with the familiar, nauseating sense of something hunting, and then the lights flickered, just like before. But this time, they didn't come back on. The room plunged into darkness, and the air grew cold, too cold, until Mark could see his breath in the air. The whispers came again, but this time, they weren't just voices. They were faces, flickering in the shadows. The house was filling with them. Figures, shadows, eyes, each one reaching out toward him, toward Ethan, their hands stretching, their mouths open in silent screams. Mark felt the floor beneath him tremble, like it was alive, like the very foundation of the house was shaking in anticipation. He turned to run, but as he turned, something gripped him. Cold, clawed fingers wrapped around his legs, pulling him to the ground. He screamed, but no sound came. The shadows were all around him, swirling, suffocating. The coldness was unbearable. He could feel the house consuming him, pulling him down into the depths of its hollow black heart. And then, just as Mark felt his mind begin to slip, just as the darkness began to consume him, he heard it. "Mark." The voice was soft, but it cut through the chaos like a knife. "Mark, don't leave me." He looked up, and there, standing just beyond the swirling shadows, was Ethan. Not the empty, hollow shell of his son, but Ethan, the boy he had once known, the boy who had smiled and laughed, who had played in the yard and talked about everything he wanted to be when he grew up. The boy who had once been full of life. "Ethan," Mark whispered, his voice breaking. But before Mark could take a step toward him, the shadows lunged forward, pulling Ethan back into the darkness. Mark reached out, but the boy's form dissolved into the void, the shadows swallowing him whole. And then the voice came again, but this time it wasn't Ethan's. It was the house. "You're already ours," Mark gasped, the air being sucked from his lungs, his chest tightening in agony as the darkness closed in around him. The last thing he saw before everything went black was a pair of glowing eyes, eyes that were not human, staring at him from the inky void, watching, waiting, consuming. Sakanti Sarak, Scene 2, The Final Surrender. Mark's mind was numb. The darkness pressed in on him from all sides, suffocating him, breaking him apart. The house, the thing inside it, had won. There was no escape. There never had been. His vision blurred, his body sinking deeper into the darkness, until it felt as if he was floating, drifting away from his own mind, from his own existence. There was no light, no warmth, only the overwhelming sense of hunger, of something waiting. And then, just as Mark thought he might fade completely into the void, he heard it. The soft whisper of a voice, distant but clear. "Come closer." He didn't know where the voice came from, but he followed it. He didn't have a choice. The darkness swallowed him whole, and he understood. The hunger was eternal. Vertrauen Chompery, the chapter. Summary. In Chapter 10, Mark's struggle against the malevolent forces within the house reaches its terrifying climax. As the house closes in, Mark realizes that he and Ethan have already been consumed by the darkness, and there is no escaping its grasp. Ethan's transformation into a hollow vessel is complete, and the house's hunger has fully taken hold. The line between reality and nightmare fades as Mark confronts the terrifying truth. The house is alive, and it has claimed them both. The chapter ends on a chilling note, leaving Mark and Ethan trapped in the endless